Something quietly shifts before anyone notices it. Not dramatically, not suddenly at all, but in the smallest, most ordinary moments, a laugh that feels a little too loud, a text replied to just a little too fast, a conversation that goes on just a little too long. Nobody announces it. Nobody names it. But something is happening beneath the surface of what looks like a perfectly normal relationship. And here is the part that most people never want to admit. Sometimes the most unsettling thing about human emotions is not betrayal, not conflict, not even loss. It is that slow, quiet feeling of coming back to life around someone who is simply new. To understand this, you have to step back from judgment for a moment, because this is not a story about bad people or broken relationships. This is a story about the human brain and how it was never really designed for permanence. Long-term relationships are one of the most beautiful things human beings can build, but they are also, by their very nature, a kind of emotional routine. And the human brain, the same brain that falls deeply in love, is also wired to respond powerfully to novelty, to anything that feels different, unpredictable, or new. So when a woman, or any person for that matter, begins to feel unusually alive around someone new, it does not always mean what people assume it means. It does not always mean the relationship is over, or that love has disappeared, or that something is broken beyond repair. Sometimes it simply means that a very specific neurological process has been triggered. And understanding that process calmly, honestly, without drama, is the only way to truly understand what is happening in modern relationships. This is that understanding. It usually starts as something small. A new colleague joins the team. An old friend reappears after years. A stranger at a social gathering says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. And something stirs, not necessarily desire, not necessarily attraction in the obvious sense, but a kind of quiet aliveness that feels different from the emotional temperature of everyday life. The first thing that changes is attention. Suddenly, conversations feel more engaging. There is an edge of uncertainty. You do not quite know what this person will say next, how they will react, what they think of you. And that uncertainty, that beautiful unpredictability, activates the brain in a way that long-term familiarity simply cannot. The second thing that changes is self-perception. Around someone new, people often become slightly more animated versions of themselves. They are funnier, more expressive, more present. Not because they are performing, but because novelty naturally pulls people out of autopilot. It demands a kind of active engagement that routine slowly, quietly trains out of us. The third shift, and this is the one most people miss, is the shift in emotional oxygen. In long-term relationships, much of the communication becomes functional. Who is picking up the children? What is for dinner? When is that bill due? The emotional vocabulary narrows. The conversations that once felt like exploration begin to feel like navigation. And without anyone intending it, without anyone being at fault, the relationship slowly begins to feel less like a living, breathing connection, and more like a very comfortable, very familiar structure. And then someone new appears, and suddenly conversation feels like exploration again. That contrast is not nothing. That contrast is everything. Here is where things actually start to change. The moment a person begins to compare how they feel in two different emotional environments, the established relationship versus the new connection, a psychological process begins that is very difficult to reverse once it gains momentum. It is not a conscious decision. It is not a moral failing. It is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. Seeking stimulation, measuring reward, calculating emotional return. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with pleasure and motivation, does not respond to what is good for us in the long run. It responds to what is new, what is uncertain, what is unpredictable. The anticipation of a reward activates dopamine more powerfully than the reward itself. And in a long-term relationship, most of the rewards are already known. The unpredictability, which was once the source of so much emotional electricity, has been replaced by something quieter, something steadier, something real. But the brain does not always know the difference between real and exciting. And so the shift begins. Not in behavior, not yet, but in internal emotional comparison. The relationship that once felt electric begins to feel ordinary in the shadow of something new. And ordinary, when you are experiencing a neurological response to novelty, can begin to feel, unfairly, like not enough. This is the turning point most people never see coming. Because from the outside, nothing has changed. But on the inside, the emotional measuring has already begun. Let us go deeper into the psychology of this. Psychologists call this phenomenon hedonic adaptation. It is the documented human tendency to return to a baseline level of emotional response, regardless of how positive or significant an experience is. In practical terms, it means that what once felt extraordinary, a relationship, a connection, a person gradually begins to feel ordinary simply through repeated exposure. This is not a character flaw. This is neurology. The brain conserves energy by automating the familiar. Things we have experienced many times before require less cognitive and emotional processing than new experiences. A long-term partner, someone whose patterns we know, whose responses we can predict, whose presence we have deeply internalized, activates less neural novelty response than a stranger who says something unexpected. This is why new connections can feel disproportionately exciting, not because they are better, not because they represent more love or deeper compatibility, but simply because they are informationally dense to a brain that has automated everything familiar. And here is what most people misunderstand about attraction. Attraction, particularly in its early stages, is not primarily about the other person. It is about the internal state that the other person triggers. The aliveness, the heightened self-awareness, the sense of expanded possibility, these are internal experiences. The new person is simply the catalyst. But because the feeling is so vivid, so present, so unmistakably real, it is very easy to confuse the catalyst with the cause. To believe that the feeling belongs to that new person, rather than understanding that it belongs to a part of ourselves that long-term routine has gradually put to sleep. This confusion between the feeling and its source is where most relationship damage is done. This is not a new story. This is not a modern problem. But modern life has made it more intense and more frequent than any previous generation has experienced. Because today, novelty is everywhere. Social media presents a continuous stream of new faces, new conversations, new emotional possibilities. Dating apps have normalized the idea that there is always someone new available, just beyond the next swipe. The cultural narrative around relationships has shifted from building something lasting to finding someone who makes you feel alive. And those two things are not always the same. In this environment, the brain's natural response to novelty is being constantly amplified. The dopamine cycle that was once triggered by occasional new encounters is now being triggered dozens of times a day by digital interactions, by the performance of attraction on screens, by the endless, frictionless availability of emotional stimulation, and long-term relationships, which are, by definition, the opposite of novelty, exist inside this environment. They have to compete emotionally and neurologically with an entire infrastructure designed to make new things feel better than existing things. This is the landscape of modern love, and understanding it is not pessimistic, it is essential. Because the couples who survive it are not the ones who are immune to novelty. Nobody is immune to novelty. The couples who survive it are the ones who understand what novelty actually is, a neurological response, not an emotional truth, and who find ways, intentionally and consistently, to reintroduce unpredictability, growth, and aliveness into the relationship they have already built. The feeling of being alive is not owned by newness. It can be cultivated in depth, but only when both people understand what they are really working with. So what does this mean for your relationship? For the people you love? For the quiet moments when something feels just slightly off, slightly flat, slightly less than it used to be? It means that the first step is honesty, not with your partner, not yet, but with yourself. The feeling of aliveness around someone new is real. It deserves to be acknowledged rather than suppressed. Because suppression does not address the underlying need, it simply drives it underground, where it becomes more powerful, more disruptive, and harder to understand. The question is not whether the feeling exists. The question is what the feeling is actually telling you. Is it telling you that your relationship is wrong? Or is it telling you that something in your relationship has gone quiet, something that used to be there, something that can be found again if both people are willing to look for it together? Most people, when they feel this aliveness around someone new, assume the answer is the former. They assume it is a signal about the wrong relationship, rather than a signal about an unmet need within the right one. This assumption, made in the fog of a dopamine response, ends more relationships than incompatibility ever has. Because what is actually being craved in most cases is not a new person. It is a feeling. Specifically the feeling of mattering, of being seen, of being engaged with fully and with curiosity. The feeling of growth, of surprise, of emotional possibility. And those feelings are not permanently located in newness. They are located in depth if anyone is brave enough to go looking for them. At what point does emotional distance actually begin in a relationship? Not when someone leaves. Not when the argument happens. Not even when the silence becomes uncomfortable. But long before any of that, in the moment when one person stops feeling truly curious about the other. When interaction shifts from discovery to management. When the relationship stops being a place where you find out who you are and becomes simply a place where you already know. And this raises something even harder. Do people leave suddenly, or do they disappear emotionally long before they are physically gone? Sit with that question, because the answer for most relationships is deeply uncomfortable and deeply important. The most honest thing that can be said about human attraction is this: we are not built for stillness. We are built for growth, for discovery, for the quiet electricity of not quite knowing what comes next. Long-term love does not fail because people are weak or selfish or easily distracted. It fails when it fails because nobody taught us that the aliveness we go looking for in someone new was something we were supposed to keep building, deliberately and carefully, in the people we already chose. The feeling is real. The question is whether we are looking for it in the right direction. Novelty fades. It always fades. But depth, when it is tended to, does not. And the relationships that last are not the ones where nothing ever felt missing. They are the ones where both people noticed when something went quiet and chose together to find it again.